Hello and welcome to another episode in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. On today's video, we're going to be going through how do I use VS Code in CloudBolt. So as a result of this, you should be able to have VS Code set up to develop in a remote instance of CloudBolt. Also some tips and tricks around some other things. We'll cover that in the agenda here in just a minute though. So let's set this up a little bit. So the business value here, the big challenge here is really when you're automating things, if there's ever anything that has manual intervention required as part of your automation processes, that leaves a margin for manual configuration errors, as well as just slow delivery processes. So CloudBolt, as an answer to that, we are an extremely open extensibility framework so that you can extend the product to talk to literally any system that has programmatic access enabled. The real big point of this video, though, is to show you how to set up VS Code in a best practice fashion so that you can develop against a remote instance of CloudBolt in your environment, and really just to help to accelerate your development efforts to get those automated processes up and running for your environment. The agenda for today's call, we're going to go through, again, best practices for developing CloudBolt with VS Code. We're going to start by covering environment setup and leveraging the remote SSH extension in VS Code to connect to your CloudBolt instance, develop code against it. We'll walk through all of those things. Then we're going to jump into an actual use case, do some standalone development, which really this is, I think a lot of customers, when they start working with CloudBolt, they'll start with one-off blueprints where they'll go and they'll build a blueprint to build one thing. And then they'll decide that system they were talking to, they have another use case for. And now what ends up happening is you have duplicated code across each of those blueprints. So standalone development's okay if you're only ever going to do one thing with the system, but really I think we're going to move from that standalone development into using what we call ZUIs in CloudBolt, which is really just at its base value, it's a Python package that includes the modules that you need to do a common integration. So just as an example, one of the things that I've built out is an NSX ZUI. There's a lot of components to it because with being a ZUI, this stands for literally anything, X standing for anything as a user interface. So one of the unique features about CloudBolt is the ability to actually extend our user interface so that it's not just what we determine you should see out of the box, but you can extend the platform to show additional information on server tabs or put up different admin web pages that you can use for managing everything inside of your environment that's cloud related or hybrid cloud related. Now, these ZUIs are extremely powerful for that, but they also give us a means and a mechanism for grouping those common integration points into an easy to export package. That exported package can then be used and referenced as part of source control and pushed up into your higher level environments so that we're following a GitOps type model as we're pushing those things into production. Finally, we're going to talk about some additional tools that I think are extremely helpful, assuming that your organization allows access to them. Things like GitHub Copilot and AWS Code Whisperer. These are AI tool integrations that will go through, and we'll walk through a real use case of actually showing how to use GitHub Copilot in VS Code to help you develop resources for CloudBolt. So we'll go through that as kind of the final touch on this video, and just show you how those tools work and talk a little bit more about why I'm such a big fan of them. AWS Code Whisperer, we don't have a live example here, but we'll talk a little bit about it. It is a good viable alternative to GitHub Copilot. It's quite a bit newer in form, but when you look at it, GitHub Copilot does charge a $10 a month fee, whereas AWS Code Whisperer, I believe, is still a free resource if you have an AWS account. So it's a potentially a good alternative. So I haven't done a ton with it yet, but I've been bouncing back and forth with it the past couple of weeks. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. When we take a look at VS Code, this is my VS Code window, but again, the best way that I found, I actually do a lot of my development in PyCharm, but we also understand a lot of our customers are doing a bunch with VS Code as well. VS Code's a very powerful code editor, but the best way that I found to work with VS Code and CloudBolt is to leverage their remote SSH connection. If you don't already have it installed, the first thing you may want to do is to go over to, I think you can search for SSH and install this remote-SSH connection. The other one that I've run into recently was this remote development. This remote development pack includes that, but also a couple of other tools. Like if you wanted to connect to Windows Subsystem for Linux or Dev Containers, it also does include the remote SSH. But I think just installing the remote SSH is probably suitable for what we're going to be doing today. So we have our remote SSH connection. I actually deleted my connection so that it appears that we're starting with a new one here in CloudBolt, or when we're talking to CloudBolt. So I don't really have anything open at this point in time, so no folder open. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit F1 in VS Code, and I need to connect to host. I don't have a host set up already for my CloudBolt instance, so I need to add a new SSH host. And when I do this, I'm going to just follow the format that they have here, the SSH, the username, and then a -a. So I'm going to do SSH. In my case, it's going to be root at my CloudBolt instance. And then -a. I then need to store that configuration somewhere. And what this does is it allows me to, when I come back and I go to remote again, it already has the not the credentials, but at least the username stored. It will prompt you for the password every time you connect to that endpoint. But you can see our host is now added, and I can just click the connect button down here at the bottom. The other thing that I can do, sorry, I'm going to leave this for a second. We'll come back over to the connection window. The other thing I can do is if I'm already connected, or I've already created that SSH connection, I can just hit that F1 button, and then I can do this connect to host, and you'll see that new host that we've added here is available in the dropdown. So, okay, back over to, okay, so we were going to connect to the system. First thing you have to do with that SSH connection is tell the system which operating system we're connecting to, and I may not have. Oh, well, it happens. So I'm going to go in and let's edit our SSH config. So we have an SSH config file here, and you can see, I don't know what salsy is, but that's never going to work. So we're going to go ahead. There we go. That should do the trick. We're going to save this config file, and then I'm going to go back to F1, connect to host, select my updated host now. I don't know why it opens a new window every time I do that, but anyway, now it's prompting me for my password. So go ahead, type in the root user password here. And for a production environment, usually what I would recommend when you're developing with CloudBolt, you probably, if you're doing some pretty heavy development, you probably want each of your developers to have their own set-aside development environment, which basically correlates to a CloudBolt server. I wouldn't go high availability. I would just deploy a single instance of CloudBolt that they can develop against. They can work with their code. And then what you can do is, if you have multiple developers that are developing, they can then, as part of a Git process, once these pieces of code are set up and running, you can leverage Git operations to make a commit for the things that you've worked on. You can then leverage like a pull request to merge that into a development branch. That development branch could then be targeted as part of a development or test or QA instance that pulls all of those developers' instance code pieces together. Then you can validate that you're not conflicting with anybody else's code that they've put together. And then after that's been validated, you can then do a final push to like a production-based branch in your Git repository that your production instance of CloudBolt is targeting. So we're not going to get much more deeper into that here, but you'll see we're now SSH'd into our server. So there's a couple of things here I can do. I could run a terminal, which since I'm connected by SSH, I can start running commands. I'm going to go ahead first, though, and I'm going to open a folder. So and really in CloudBolt, the folder that I care about when we're developing is going to be var opt CloudBolt. And you can see it does give you, it fills in the paths as you go through. Var opt CloudBolt ProServe. And this ProServe directory is a special purpose directory on the operating system. When we go through upgrades, anything that exists under this ProServe directory is exempt from being changed during an upgrade. We don't want to impact any code that a customer may have living in this directory. So this is kind of a safe space for you to do development in CloudBolt. So I'm just going to map directly to the ProServe directory. And you'll see once this loads, it's going to prompt me for the password again. But now that this is loaded up and we've accessed our CloudBolt environment, we could repeat that for different CloudBolt instances if you have more than one that you're developing against. But now that we're here, we have all of the ProServe directory thing, and I have a lot of code that I've built. There's 3 years worth of content here for all kinds of different things. So you'll see all of the content that I've built. Yeah, there's a lot of things going on in here. But now that we're connected, we have, I'm going to close my config file. We can open files here. We can edit them. CloudBolt doesn't quite know about them yet. We still need to tell the system about the files, and we'll get to that here as we're building these use cases out. But we can start to develop. We can create a new directory. I try and keep the directories named with the purpose that they're being built for. It's not always perfect because it's a personal development instance, but maybe things that we're doing against vCenter. I have a directory here where these are all vCenter oriented Python modules that I'm building to do automation inside of CloudBolt. So leveraging the SSH connection to talk to your CloudBolt system. The other thing that we get from SSH access with the SSH extension is the ability to actually terminal directly in VS Code, and I will use this for a lot of things. Number one, Shell Plus access, and I have another video that goes into building things in Shell Plus, and that's not included as part of this VS Code setup series just because that applies regardless of the IDE that you're using. It's how to use Shell Plus once your environment is set up and communicating with your CloudBolt appliance. That Shell Plus component then comes in. So, if you wanted to, you can go back and find the how do I use developer tools inside of CloudBolt. And there's a Shell Plus section in there that walks through the process of creating an actual module inside of CloudBolt. So, but the other thing we can do here is terminal. We can get to Shell Plus. We can check our logs. So a lot of times when I'm building integrations, I may want to just do a tail on my var log CloudBolt application. That log, and then this would give me a running detail of everything that's happening in CloudBolt. If I see errors, they show up here right away. The other thing I do a lot of is just restart Apache from the terminal. If we're building a ZUI, the Apache restarts are required to pull those elements back into the CloudBolt system. So that's about it for the VS Code setup piece. Now that I'm set up, I can start developing against CloudBolt. We're going to move on to leveraging VS Code for development of a single use case, and this could be addressed for blueprint development. It could be applied to orchestration, action development, all of those kinds of things. This is really kind of an overarching idea of how to leverage VS Code to create a CloudBolt plugin, and just my preferred method there. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's just start with a new blueprint. We're going to call this. Let's go with the super generic example, right? Because this video or this section of this video is not about the content that we're creating itself, but it's more about the processes in VS Code and CloudBolt and how to get those two to work together well. So it's going to be a really basic Python module that we're creating here, but we're going to go ahead and do hello world. We don't really care about any of this. I am going to, let's leave this as service. That's fine for now. But I'm going to leave everything else pretty generic. Once my blueprint's created, there's a couple of warnings here. That just means that there's some additional configuration required before we can do anything with this blueprint. I'm going to go ahead and add a group. Just that way it's ready to go. Any group can deploy is sufficient for my use case, but you may determine maybe we want to constrain this to maybe my admins group, so only my admins see this test blueprint. Now that the group membership has been set, we're going to go over to our build tab. And the build tab is really where we're going to be doing some of our work. I'm going to pre-create my hello world action here think I already have a Hello World CloudBolt plugin written, so we'll see where this goes. But I'm going to create a new plugin action. I'm going to call this, let's see if this works. It may just complain, but we'll find out here soon. Shared would allow me to share this CloudBolt plugin with other components in the system. I'm not going to do that for now. We're just going to use it for this specific example. Leave everything else the same, and we're going to save. That, yep, sorry, there you go. Hello world again. Now that we've created an item on our canvas, there is a default kind of blank out-of-the-box CloudBolt plugin that we give you. I'm actually going to copy this and get this into my clipboard. Then I'm going to go over to VS Code. And here's really where we start to do the magic. In VS Code, I prefer leveraging a code editor or an IDE to work with things inside of CloudBolt. We're going to use this MB testing directory. So in VS Code, we are mapped to my CloudBolt ProServe directory. And under there, I have this MB testing folder that we're going to be using for this. I already have a hello world. I don't. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this hello world.py. So a new Python file, VS Code. If you don't already have it, go to the extensions. You want to make sure that you have extensions and linters that can understand Python. That'll just help with this highlighting. Usually, if you don't have it already and you start working with Python CC's py files, it'll prompt you at the lower right-hand corner to say, do you want to install these particular tools that will help you understand and read and parse Python. This is a very basic example, but we are going to just modify this a little bit. I'm going to do, I don't really need, we're not running this on a server, we're just running a blueprint. So I'm going to kind of get rid of all of that. And I'm really just going to do something very simple. I'm going to say hello world as a logging item, and I'm going to print that inside of the CloudBolt UI. So even simpler than the out-of-the-box method. I'm not going to do this if-else, like the if true, and I am going to return a success method. We don't have to do this. If you don't return it, it assumes that it is a success. Actually, I'm going to tell it that's the method I'm going to return for a success. I'm not going to go into a ton of what we're doing here. This is really just around VS Code and leveraging this to work as our editor for making code changes in CloudBolt. So now that we've created a Python script inside of VS Code, VS Code is mapped to my ProServe directory. So this actually lives on my CloudBolt appliance. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come in, go back over to, I think I picked the wrong, let's close that one because I've already done a lot there. Come back over to my Hello World blueprint, and notice this is a blueprint, a build item. This build item is backed by a CloudBolt plugin. The CloudBolt plugin is really where we want to go to edit anything about this plugin. It can then be reshared in multiple different contexts, like a blueprint build item. But you see our code here. This is still the original code. What we're going to update now, though, is really we're going to edit this to fetch from URL, and we're going to use this to pull the file content directly from my CloudBolt directories. So I'm going to start by doing file, colon. Then I'm going to do 2 forward slashes. This is how CloudBolt knows to reference the file system. Then I'm going to go ahead and do another forward slash because I'm starting to type out my path to that ProServe directory. So var opt CloudBolt ProServe / MB _testing, and then I believe it was hello world .py. I'm going to actually purposefully typo this and just do a .p here. Copy this. I don't remember if this caches it if there's an error. But look, if we save it and the path was wrong, it's going to give us an error. This is still showing that original version. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to fix my path, add that .py. I'm going to save again. And then what should happen if it's correct, now we see this script being called from the guest system on the CloudBolt appliance. So again, the big reason I do that is it allows me to use an IDE or a code editor that is external to CloudBolt. This editor in the system is okay for some minor changes, but it doesn't tell me if I forget a quotation here. It doesn't tell me. It doesn't. That's a very simple syntax error that I make all day long, every single day of the week. And if it can't tell me that, then it's probably not going to help me out a ton in my automation processes. So, and also, let's do this. If I change something now that this is backed by a file in CloudBolt, one of the things to note is that if I go to save code, it's going to appear to save. But if I refresh this now, you're going to see that that code actually disappears. So just know that when there's a source URL set here, this is a read-only file because we're always going to pull the code from this URL that's linked here. Also, by the way, this source URL can be used to point at your Git repositories. So GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. As long as you have a raw file URL, you can point this directly at those files, and now GitHub is your source of truth. So you could leverage the local file system in CloudBolt, or you could also be developing, commit that to Git, and then have CloudBolt look at a particular branch where we're always pulling in that latest update from your Git repository. So just another mechanism to keep in mind. But now that I have this here, I'm really set up to work in VS Code, and I can go through and develop as much as I want. And I can know that when I bounce back over to the blueprint, that this code is going to be updated every time I run it. And we're just going to go ahead and run this real quick. Let's just run this to get that set progress method that should just say hello world. We're going to say run it for my IT group. We're not seeing any inputs because we didn't declare any inputs yet. And let's see. Okay, so our blueprint is now done. We can click on the Hello World job. And we can see there's my Hello World method. And this is just telling us that this job completed. And here's that success method the success that we printed out. So that set progress is handy. It allows us to give user-oriented information. We did create a resource here. I probably should just get rid of that. I should have done none here, but either way, the point is that our action now is backed by our file system, which we set up with VS Code. So for a single use case, this works really well. And for single use cases, I might, for maybe I'm building an AWS S3 bucket, I might define a CloudBolt plugin that builds that AWS S3 bucket. And if I don't ever have to reuse any of the content inside of that file, this is a great way to do that. So just single one-off use case. We're not trying to use that API for anything else. This is a really good way to build your Python module inside of your VS Code editor, and then reference it from the file inside of the CloudBolt system. Now we're going to take a look at let's just say multi-purpose development for CloudBolt. I don't know of a better term for that, but when we start to use CloudBolt for more than just a single blueprint, maybe there's a blueprint and a corresponding orchestration action, or there is a grouping of orchestration actions that all are leveraging the same API. If we take the approach that we've taken with this Hello World example, where we're building a single integration for each of the API calls that we need to do, what ends up happening is we're duplicating all of our code, and I hate duplicating code. It's challenging. It builds up technical debt for the organization. So I really try and build out CloudBolt as something that's composable and a little more modular in nature, so that we can reuse and share those resources. There are a couple. Let's say there are two ways that I can think of that are good for sharing those kinds of things across different content types in CloudBolt. We can, in CloudBolt, we can create our own Python modules for each of those types under our ProServe directory, where we could house one file that holds everything that has to do with maybe, let's take GitHub as an example, because that's what I'll show here in a minute. But maybe we need to connect to GitHub. We need to make some API calls, and we have multiple things that all need to make different API calls, but there's no sense in rewriting our authentication lines and all of those things. So we want to put it in a place where it can be shared. And I could just create a directory in ProServe that's called GitHub, and I could put a shared GitHub module under here. And that would be okay, and I could reference that from blueprints in CloudBolt, I can reference it from other things. Now, the challenge becomes, though, is if I'm building a module on my guest OS, and it's just called from other automations, that doesn't get exported as part of those blueprints getting exported. So usually the way that I tend to err for those kinds of use cases is I prefer to bundle those kinds of things inside what we call a XUI in CloudBolt. And XUI stands for, it's XUI, it stands for anything, that's your X, as a user interface. And the reason that I prefer XUIs is that when we use a XUI to house similar automations for a common system, that XUI can be a self-composable instance that can then be exported, including everything that we need and importing that whole package into the next environment that we're trying to talk to. And it gives me the additional functionality of enabling some additional features inside of my user interface if I choose to do that. So just as an example, this Git management XUI that I'm working on, I have an admin extension, so an admin page here, where I can actually go out and first of all define some personal access tokens for myself. I can then create Git configurations that target a repository and a branch, whether that's in GitHub or GitLab. Then I can go over and I can, for each of these samples, all of these blueprints that I have in CloudBolt, or server actions, or orchestration actions, or recurring jobs, I can commit these directly to Git from CloudBolt. And it'll use my personal access token. These are all protected on a per user basis, so I only see my own tokens. Other users only see their own tokens. That way it's tied to my user account. I don't have to do any additional steps. So it's kind of a one-step export directly to Git. We can put comments in there as part of the export after we've selected our Git config and where we want to export this to. That Git comment then would be included as part of the commit that we're making. Or maybe we want to commit multiple blueprints at a time. We could also select from multiple blueprints that show up inside of this list, so that we can export multiple contents as different commits that are going to show up in my Git branch and really adopt GitOps inside of CloudBolt. But again, the big point here is the XUI. I have these server tabs that are these tabs for different content types inside of CloudBolt. But I need to, for a lot of these things, I need to call back to the GitHub API. So I needed a way that I could standardize all of my GitHub API calls. And the way that I've chosen to address that, jump back over to VS Code here, we can see that I have this XUI directory and I have this Git management directory underneath of it. So this is a XUI that we created in CloudBolt. You can also, if you so desire, for XUIs, you can go to admin and UI extensions. You can select create a package, and this will walk you through the process for creating different types of extensions for CloudBolt. It'll actually create a skeleton file for those different types of extensions, but I could create something that is one of these different types, and then I have a framework to start working with that I can get to in VS Code. So working with this this would get the framework set up, and then you can start to build this out. Now, the way that I've addressed this, I like to have a utilities folder or shared Python module that I will reference from everything that I'm doing across here. And that allows me to put all of my shared content that I'm using in blueprints and orchestration actions, all of these different components. I can call them all from one module where I'm housing all of that shared content. Like I mentioned, the big thing I want to cover here is just the Git connection info. Give me a second. I have a lot going on in this shared file. And all of this is referenceable. So I built this GitHub wrapper class. This GitHub wrapper class includes all of the information that I need to pull in my GitHub auth token from the user that has initiated that request, as well as all of the logic that I need to do git, post, patch, put, delete methods as I'm talking to the REST API. And then I have kind of just a generic request. So any request that I'm sending to this, I can call this request method. And then the rest of this is just different API calls that I'm making to the get API. So anytime that I'm using this shared content via the format of a ZUI, I'm referencing, I first go in and initialize my GitHub wrapper class. I pass in my user and my Git config, and then I can start to make REST calls really easily because I've centralized this. I don't have to go through and recreate the wheel and have duplicate code pieces out there everywhere inside of my environment. So would highly recommend researching the ZUI route for things that, again, this would be used for development where we're writing some kind of centralized code that can be called in multiple contexts from CloudBolt. The ZUI then allows us to export and import into a new environment and just makes things pretty straightforward in CloudBolt to work with some of those more complex scenarios. We're now going to talk about within the last year at the time of this video recording, just the new developer tools that are available in the market. And these aren't necessarily specific to CloudBolt, but I'm really referring to AI development tools. And there's a couple of them out there. The first one that I've done the most work with is going to be GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot really helps to accelerate my development efforts. AWS also has a product called Code Whisperer that came out a few weeks ago. I've done a little bit with it. I actually couldn't get it to work in VS Code in a short amount of time, so I'm not going to cover too much of that. Just know that AWS Code Whisperer is out there. I believe it is also free, a free resource that you can use for Code Whisperer. So maybe that's something to give a shot. GitHub Copilot does cost $10 a month. But like I said, it has absolutely just changed the way that I write code for CloudBolt because it's aware of a lot of other APIs and it's a language model that understands what I'm trying to do in code and can take those things and kind of interpret what I'm trying to do. So I'm just going to build out a real quick example and do some demonstrations with GitHub Copilot. Just some prerequisites here. You do need to have the GitHub Copilot extension installed. Once it's installed, you should see the Copilot logo down here. You can also then, once it's installed, you could deactivate it globally. You could go to do more with settings. You can manage your extension, all of those kinds of things. What I'm going to do, though, is just kind of walk through an example where we're building out a CloudBolt plugin that does something with GitHub Copilot. So, and we're going to see how accurate we can get with a little bit of detailed documentation in the modules that we're building. So I'm going to build a new file, and I'm thinking that we want to go through and do, let's give it a name. Just GitHub Copilot test. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get this started. I'm not sure if this will understand my run method, but you can already see. So notice, all I typed in was def run, and GitHub Copilot, because it has visibility over my the other files that I'm running, it understands that this run method is the insertion point for CloudBolt plugins. It's already giving me a real quick hint. All I have to do to accept this is press tab, and it's going to give me this is now a functioning run method for the CloudBolt system. It's not really going to do anything other than print a log for hello world and return a success hello world. We'll do a little bit more than that with this here in a minute. But you'll notice that this, now let's see, I don't know if I can get my imports here. I kind of have to know where those things are coming from. I can get those from Shell Plus. So we'll go through that exercise here in just a minute. But we have our run method. One of the things just up front I will say with GitHub Copilot and really any AI technology in general, especially when it comes to writing code, these things are very good at getting close to what you need to do. They're good at structuring loops and code constructs. However, a lot of times they will guess at what the API calls are or what the payload is needed for those API calls. So I usually test every step as I'm going through this and make sure that each line functions before moving on to the next. But it's a really good way to help speed up things that you're doing inside of your environment. It does in a lot of cases will knows about the actual APIs for the product we're trying to talk to, but just keep that in mind. You do want to validate what the system is attempting to put in here. It's not always right. It will make up functions and methods that don't actually exist. So, but like I said, the degree of accuracy, even 1 year into the product, is pretty surprising. So let's go ahead and do a run method. Actually, I'm going to do, let's see. So maybe a good example to start with here is to go through, let's use one of the SDKs that we already have under the covers in CloudBolt, and that's going to be the PyVMomi SDK, which is the Python software developers kit for talking to vCenter. So this is just, again, a fairly basic example where we're going to go through, and maybe we have a server in CloudBolt where we want to go out, and from that server object, we go and get the virtual machine in PyVMomi, and then we do something with that PyVMomi virtual machine. Maybe we list all of the snapshots in PyVMomi. So this is all kind of on the fly. So let's see how this works. But we're going to do get all snapshots from VM, and I'm gonna pass in the VM here. Actually, I'm gonna be a little more intentional about how I do this. I am gonna pass in the PyVMomi wrapper. We're gonna get that here in just a minute. So here's a start. So one of the things I'll also show you, I'm going to give this a better description, because the better description you give this, the more complete the suggestions from GitHub Copilot are. The other thing that I'll point out here, there's a couple of hints here where except with tab, if I hit tab, it's going to take this entire suggestion. Oh, come on. We could also accept like the next word, which would be control right arrow. We can also cycle through different selections here with the keys here. Or if we want to get up to 10 different completions with GitHub Copilot, we can hit Control Enter, and that's going to show us a list of 10 different solutions that takes a guess. And we can go through, look at these, and take a guess at which of these solutions, or not take a guess, but determine which of these we want to take. But before doing that, I do want to make a better description, because GitHub Copilot is far better at looking at the descriptions and going from there. So actually, I'm just going to take in the server. I'm going to say taking a CloudBolt server object, get the corresponding vCenter VM from PyVMomi. Okay, so there's a decent description here. I'm going to go ahead and knock it down to the next line. Let's do. Okay, so this is starting to, and notice this, as far as I'm aware, GitHub Copilot, it can see the directories in the project you're working with. So it has a lot of information about things that I'm already doing in CloudBolt. So it can see things like our imports. So we're importing a vSphere resource handler. We can get the vSphere resource handler from the server. That's close, but not quite what I would do. But getting the service instance from the API wrapper is exactly the next step. The virtual machine, then getting the API. We don't need to go through and get the API wrapper again, but let's kind of, I'm going to do a Control Enter, and I'm going to look at a couple of different suggestions here and determine which one I want to accept here. So let's do, I guess we just click on the link to accept solution. We don't need to import all of this, I can tell you that. So that's way too much. So this is a little better. This is what I was hinting at. Resource handler equals server. The server objects have a resource handler that it links to its resource handler from the server object. I just know that from experience. You could also leverage Shell Plus as you're testing and validating these out. So if we go in and launch Shell Plus in our terminal, we can first go through and get a server object and just validate that this is what we want to see. So this is where the validation piece comes in, is I can do, I already have a server in my history, so I can hit the up. I now have that server object. From that server, I can get the resource handler. I can tab this out, validate that that is the resource handler. Now notice this resource handler is of the type resource handler. What we actually want is that that we showed in the first sample, the vSphere resource handler. And the way that we get that in CloudBolt under the covers, what we're doing is this is a generic resource handler class. Every server is tagged to a generic resource handler class, but that resource handler class then has a backing specific resource technology that we're working with. And we can get to that by doing a cast operation. So that's how we get to our vSphere resource handler. And from the vSphere resource handler, we can do, I don't think the service instance is right here, so we might take a mixture of what they have going on. Let me just check. Service instance, I don't know that that's correct. I think it's making up some things here, but this, I think that first suggestion that I liked is a good start. So I'm going to accept this for now, and we can continue to go through, and you can type up line by line. It's going to keep going through, but we can validate this in Shell Plus. Really, really, really handy. We're going to do RH equals, so we're just going to take that line. We're then going to go through. Let's see if this works. Again, yeah, this hypervisor line does not exist, but let's just walk through this process. Let's see what this looks like. That doesn't work. We do need to get to the service instance, though. So I did kind of like my first suggestion, but let's. The connection might work. It looks a little closer. Let's give it a shot down here. Okay, so there is no. We've gotten to our technology wrapper. So we have our API wrapper, but we don't have a get connection. So I'm just going to do. In Shell Plus just to help augment, because it doesn't know everything about our API. I can do get underscore, make sure that get API wrapper is valid. That is a method. So now we have our API wrapper. And then from here, I could store that as API wrapper, but I can also just dot reference it. Actually, I need to store it because it's a method. It needs to function. I'm just going to call this wrapper. And then I can tab through the wrapper to find out what exactly I can do here. Now, the service instance, like I mentioned, we need to get to this service instance to use the PyVMomi stuff. So let's look at SI connection. That looks like a service instance. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that and see if we can keep moving on. So SI connection, so that should do the trick, I'm hoping. And then we can do SI content and see if this works. I'm pretty confident that service instance was grabbed correctly. No, I didn't store it as SI. So now I have my SI content. Let's just verify that I have something there. Okay, it looks like it's got my SI content. Then get VM by UUID. I'm not sure where this is coming from. I'm assuming this thought that there was a method here somewhere, but let's try. I'm just going to delete it, and it's going to go through. I'm going to do a control enter and try and get some suggestions here. I just wanted suggestions for VM, but get VM by UUID. Where's that coming from? Is that something that we need to import? It doesn't tell me. I believe search index is what we want to do. So I'm going to take this suggestion, just having done this. Let's see if this works. So there's no result returned. I'm not really sure what the find by UUID is expecting, but I can do SI. See if we have a search index in the SI. Let's do this. SI dot search index. There is no for SI content. Okay, so there's a search index, so that works. And then there's a find by UUID. Find all by UUID, or we can do find by UUID. Find by UUID is going to be a little bit more unique. Let's do, I'm going to leave this kind of just hover there, and hopefully that gives me some suggestions. Or if I hit enter, it might tell me an error, required field UUID not provided. I'm not sure if UUID goes first is the challenge. I'm waiting for. Over here. I don't know what this is expecting. And this is where GitHub Copilot, again, gets me a lot of the way there, but sometimes I just need to go back to good old-fashioned Google. So, UUID. So it's got me most of the way there. It's at least got the service instance, which is a start from CloudBolt. Just understanding how to get to that service instance if you're working with a VMware machine. So this looks to be about true. They're passing the UUID in. I'm just not sure. So I think the question that I have is, I'm going to take their suggestion again. I'm going to give this a shot in the command line. Actually, I'm going to get rid of that last true. I still don't think this is going to work. Let's see, VM. Oh, there we go. I just had an additional statement here. I'm not sure what that true is for, but it looks like we have my virtual machine. We can do VM dot, I think just name will work. There we go. That's the server in question. So we have our virtual machine object. So we know that that worked. And now let's see if we can get to this snapshot list. Okay, so another guess. Let's go through and do VM.snapshot. No, so there are no snapshots on this virtual machine. Let's take a snapshot real quick and see if we get that passed in. Okay, so I've taken a snapshot, and we can now see VM.snapshot gives us the snapshot information. And I'm wondering if we get that root snapshot list, if that's going to, there we go. So that would actually, in this case now, between GitHub Copilot and Shell Plus, we've validated all of this code. We now have a new method where we can just take a CloudBolt virtual machine, and if we're running this, depending on where this job runs, we could just pass the server in directly, like if this is an orchestration action, the server would be passed in as part of the arguments here. So now the server's getting passed in to get all snapshots from VM. One last thing I will do is I'm just going to test this end to end. I'm going to store this entire function in my Shell Plus window down here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to try and get all snapshots from the server. So let's store that as snapshots. Get all snapshots from VM. There we go. We can see we've captured a single snapshot. So you could then loop through this and do other things with it, or maybe you wanted to get all snapshots so that you could delete all snapshots, those kinds of things. Again, just a really quick example of how to leverage GitHub Copilot. It does take some poking through, and depending on the APIs that you're working with, it's going to be more or less familiar with them depending on what that is. But one of the things I would highly recommend is that Control-Enter capability that gives you suggestions based off of where your cursor is. In this case, this is exactly what we need, so it's not going to give me additional suggestions. But the ability to just poke through and see different options that you can choose and use inside of the code. So again, GitHub Copilot is a great tool to help you develop and get your automation processes up and running quicker in CloudBolt. This concludes another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt series. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Thanks for sticking around for the entire thing. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to your account team. We'd be happy to dive into any of these topics a little bit further. If you have ideas for additional videos that you'd like to see in this series, please let us know. We're always looking for new ideas and things to cover to help you in your automation journey. So Thanks again, and happy automating with CloudBolt.